One, two. All right. What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It is Henry Zamota, and I'm joined by Danny Abdel-Jabbar right now. How's it going, my young sir?
I'm doing well. How about yourself, man?
I'm doing very well. It is it's Derby Day.
Derby Day.
Derby Day. It's a couple national holidays right now. It's the it's the Derby.
Mm-hmm.
It is May 4th Day.
May the 4th be with you.
It's the Star Wars dork
Yep.
holiday where everyone dresses up like a stormtrooper or Darth Maul if you're a real big weirdo. It's I make fun of the me and my roommate. My roommate's a really big Star Wars dork, and I'm a really big. He's the biggest Star Wars dork I've ever met in my life. Like, he has a framed picture of R2-D2 on his wall.
All right, I'm not that dorky.
He reads all the books. He read all the comics. He's an adult who watches the Clone Wars show,
the cartoons,
cartoons, and all the other ones. He does just a massive. You would never know too, because he doesn't seem like he would be that Star Wars dork material. But he's a Star Wars dork. We got into a big argument last night, and I don't even know who's right or wrong. I think he might be right. But I said that the Game of Thrones universe is larger than the Star Wars universe. And we got into like a really, really big argument over it. Like, I was like, the Game of Thrones universe there's more intellectual property of the Game of Thrones universe. And he's like, there's no way that there's more intellectual property for the Game of Thrones universe. There's no way.
Dude, I'm on your roommate side, dude.
No, he's definitely right when I thought about it, because Star Wars has been around since the 70s, and they've written so many books, and they've written so many.
It's not even that. Let's just go into the lore and be like, okay, cool. We have Westeros, we have Essos, and we have Southos or whatever, Southteros. In fucking Star Wars, we have galaxies, like a whole galaxy worth of shit. Like. How far can you go in Game of Thrones? Not very.
But here's the thing with Game of Thrones, though, as far as the main story. So the Game of Thrones world exists. I'm going to nerd out a bit. So Westeros in the Game of Thrones, it's 12,000 years old, and they count that the 12,000 mark begins when the first men arrived through a land bridge in Dorne. And arrived in Westeros, and then they engaged in war with the first children, the children of the forest.
Children of the forest.
And they got into a big war, and they eventually became allies because they had to fight the White Walkers. And the children of the forest actually created the White Walkers to fight the first men. But later down the line, that like the first men, they basically.
Wait, I think you might be getting this confused.
No, I'm not.
No. I think the first men come from the north. The Andals come from the south.
No, they both come from Essos. Like, humanity and Game of Thrones, it starts in Essos.
No, I know they both do. I think, but the people who crossed that land bridge down in the south, I think they were the Andals. No, excuse me. Yeah, they were the Andals.
The Andals. Now I'm really gonna dork out. The Andals, they arrived where the Vale is. So you know where the Vale is, and like look at the Game of Thrones map and
the Fingers.
Yeah, the Fingers. That's where they arrived, and that's why the Knights of the Vale, like the Vale, that's the most heavily populated pure blood Andals place in the Game of Thrones universe.
Like Jorah the Andal.
Yeah.
R.I.P.
Well, Jorah is actually a first man. They just call them Andals because the Dothraki don't really know any. Like, they just think that everyone's an Andal because that was the most recent invasion. But what's really interesting about Game of Thrones and that whole universe is that they actually, George R. R. Martin is a student of history. That's the first thing you need to take into account. And he really based Westeros off a oversized England. So what he did is that Westeros is about the size of South America. That's what he says. And he really just kind of exaggerated a lot of the things that were going on within England. And
it's also like upside down too. Yeah.
He exaggerated a lot of the wars that were going on in England in like the 15th century, the 15th, 16th century. So that's really a lot where all the conniving and politicking comes from. And then Essos is supposed to be Eurasia, so like I think it is everywhere from Turkey to China.
Hmm.
Um, but he
And
West the
Dorne
first
is definitely Spain. Let's be real.
yeah, Dorne is 100% based off Spain. He said it himself that they filmed the Dorne sections of the show in Spain. What they did, which was really interesting, was that they really, when you look at the first man migration in Game of Thrones, like when the first men they migrated over, and then the Andel, the migration later, it was like 6,000 years later. That completely mimics English history, like the history of the Britain Islands,
Yeah,
because
the War of the Roses, I think it was called, right?
well, just like the migration itself, because
Hmm.
I think the Northerners, what they're supposed to represent, they're the men of the first, they're the first men, like they're the pure, fierce men. They're supposed to represent the Celtics,
Hmm.
like the Celt, the first settlers in that area in England, and then the Andals are supposed to represent the Anglo-Saxons who later invaded it. Because England has been invaded a million times. The
Right.
Celtics, the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans have been invaded a bunch of many times. Like all of Europe has been invaded a million times. Like it's such a diverse. If you looked at DNA, like the Europe would probably be the most ethnically diverse place on the entire planet, just because the pure amount of just invasions and ancient peoples migrating through and throughout Europe. So it's super interesting that he kind of based the Game of Thrones universe off those migrations specifically into the UK. So it's really cool. It's just really cool, and like you can't help when like looking at Game of Thrones, to see all the different parallels between that and actual history. The guy's brilliant, and it's
Hmm.
really cool. I'm just nerding out like right
He
now.
needs to hurry up and write those goddamn books, though. Jeez.
Dude, all right, we'll get into this later, but I think it's really sad that George R. R. Martin can't. They don't have the source material to work off the new episodes, because George R. R. Martin is such a freaking just brilliant fiction writer
Yeah.
that it's
Well,
just
put a pin in that. We'll talk about Game of Thrones
all
after
right. Let's
the
get into
main
the real
topic.
topic. All right, don't want to bore you with the dork fest right here, but I just had to have an open up. We're talking about China today.
China.
China. We are talking about basically, what's the status right now? Where does the U.S. Where does U.S. foreign policy stand with China? How do we look at it? What are the implications in the future? I think the good question to lead off and set the tone of the show would be, is China a foe or is China a competitor? Danny, I know that you have some insight on that.
Definitely. So you sent me today a pretty long press conference talking about the recent China report, which the U.S. military produces every year to talk about basically what's China up to, what are they doing, what are we doing in response, things like that. And one point that really struck me that I think is really, really important, especially for the context of the show, is that China is a competitor to us. They are not a foe. They are not our enemy. And the U.S. goes to great lengths to make sure that the world and especially China understands that we're not enemies. We're not adversaries. We don't use that language when we speak about China. We want to encourage competition amongst our countries because competition is good, as we know with capitalism. But despite a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in this show, including military expansionism, weapons technology, and a number of other things, that might seem on the face of it aggressive. I think it's important to note that China is just a competitor of ours. They're not, they're not in any way, we don't see them as a existential threat. And I think that's super important to start with.
They're not the White Walkers,
Right. No.
I think that's important to point out is like, yeah, we're competing with China right now in business. We're competing with them even in foreign investment. We're
That's right.
competing with them in a lot of different categories. But right now, as the U.S. looks at it, the U.S. does not look at China as a enemy. They don't look at them as a threat to security or any way like that. They see them as they see that they are just are competing. They're a competing interest group, really, in U.S. endeavors around the world. And to be more specific, probably U.S. endeavors in the Pacific Ocean, in the South Pacific, really probably would be the most. Just because the U.S. has so many bases over there, and they have their own interest as well. But China's huge, and China is kind of a bully state at the same time.
A little bit. Very
China,
much so.
China does a lot of, all right, let's just brush away all the human rights violations that go on in the country, like having surveillance, mass surveillance, having concentration camps in Western China, having social credit scores, throwing people in jail, journalists in jail. It's not a good place for human rights. And for freedom, no. For economic freedom, it's surprisingly probably more economically free than the U.S.
That's right.
However, and as far as personal freedom, just there's literally a social credit score that ranks you. And the question can really be asked about the social credit score is this a way to provide additional surveillance by having tattletales that will do things like the Soviet Union used to do to give rankings, or is it a way to create an indulgent system where people, because you can actually get out of your low,
you can pay out of it, right? And we talked about this in a previous episode. I don't know if we still have that up, but if you're not already subscribed to Patreon, you'll definitely get access to that as well.
Yeah, buddy. But yeah, I think it's important to carry out those roles. China does not have a good human rights record, but right now, as far as and internationally as well, China is engaging in a lot of bad practices that are kind of, it really actually depends on who you ask, because the big project right now that most of you are probably aware of, or there's the two big projects that are going on are the Made in China project, which is that's more internal, where they want to create more technology and become a leader in tech field and stuff like that. But the big one is the Belt and Road Initiative, and what they're doing there is that they're trying
one belt.
One road, one belt. They're trying to get port access to all these countries so they can basically make maritime routes and shipping routes, and not only that, as well as land routes to ship China-made products, because if everything goes by sea, which what is like the current what they do right now, most of Chinese products are shipped out of their ports. It takes about 30 days to ship something from one country to another country, especially in the Western Hemisphere, or at least into Europe. They want to be able to have a way to shorten that and make a road system that they'll be able to kind of control and push out their Chinese products.
They're trying to build the modern day Silk Road.
Exactly. Exactly what they're doing. And it's something.
That's why they have so much interest in those Middle Eastern countries, like Afghanistan, for example. They're trying to exert some influence there so that they can create this new Silk Road.
Yeah. And another thing to point out is that China also does engage in very shady debt lending activities. So
very predatory lending,
predatory lending activities where they lend out money for infrastructure projects that people cannot actually pay back.
Right.
Depending on who you ask, though, like there's a lot of people, and I just read this piece. I forget where I read it from. I think it might have been in like foreignpolicy.com or something like that, where they were interviewing a bunch of Serbians and people like in Serbia. There was actually a lot of positivity over the project because the infrastructure and the debt would create more jobs. But meanwhile, the country's in massive debt to China. So, I mean, I guess every country's in massive debt to China when you think about it.
Yeah.
But it's just an interesting dynamic. Depends on who you ask, would probably have negative connotations or positive connotations. I think the average person right now, for the immediate future, they probably would like it. But in the long run, having your country in crippling debt and having these predatory lending schemes on your country are probably going to screw a lot of things up economically for you in the long run. But all right, let's let's move on. The big thing to take note is that China has increased its military spending.
That's right. Huge.
This has been a really big incline over the past couple of years. So typically the biggest spenders, and please correct me if I'm wrong, U.S. is always number one. We outspend.
That's right.
As far as military goes.
We outspend the next 10 countries combined.
But
And that's still true today.
yeah. Typically, number two, Russia is always in that two spot. But now we see that China's in that two spot.
Right.
Russia, I believe, is at number four, with Saudi Arabia being number three. And Saudi Arabia is number three, obviously, because they're
Actually, just looking at this graph now, they're actually number 6, believe it or
oh,
not. So
who's number five?
let's run through it, right?
Okay,
So
okay.
as of 2017, because this is the website that I got, and that was the numbers that I was able to find. As of 2017, United States at $597.2 billion, giant box. China at $228.2 billion, so a sizable chunk. And then, surprisingly enough, Saudi Arabia at $69.5 billion, which, when I first saw it, surprised me. And then just after thinking about it critically for a second, made total sense, especially with the war in Yemen going on right now. They definitely need a military spending to get that done. Closely following them is India at $59.8 billion. Then, believe it or not, France at $56.3 billion. And finally, Russia with $55.3 billion. And then it rounds out after that with the United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, and South Korea. And those are our top 10 military spenders in the world.
Yeah, I guess I should have known that. That France always has a really big military budget, as well as India, because India is another country that's like always kind of on the verge of war.
Yeah.
So I guess Russia is a lot more resourceful with their budgets and how they spend their money, because I mean that's just what their economy warrants. All right, so China is increasing a lot in their military budget has jumped.
That's right.
Why do you think that's so?
Well, I mean, there's a number of reasons that we'll go over the course of the episode here, but I think what's also super important to point out about their budget is that we're talking about official Chinese defense budget, like statements. So what China has said that they have spent. However, military spending in general is kind of a loose term. So like the question would be, if you build out if you go to the South China Sea or the East China Sea, where they're having a lot of kind of conflict with the rest of the world, like for example in the Spratly Islands, and you build up a manufactured island, so that you can stake a claim to it. Is that military spending or is it not? Right. So there are different. There's not a whole lot of consensus in the world community about how much they're spending, but what's important is that there are other estimates that put China's spending at even higher than what they're claiming to have spent. And it might make sense for China to kind of lowball their spending numbers, right? I think that's just pretending like you spend a little less so that people sleep on you, and so they're not taken as a threat. But I'm sorry, I didn't directly answer your question. What are they spending the money on? A whole lot of shit. Everything from, creating brand new fighters, jets, that is, to, building aircraft carriers, which they're kind of trying to jump into now, to, submarine technology. And those are just the military tech applications, but also on a lot of other things, like, for example, South and East China Seas are in dispute right now. So they're spending a lot of money to basically prop up those regions so that they have like a strong military foothold in them. And they're even taking a look at the Arctic, and they're having a lot of activity up there, which the rest of the world is also eyeing the Arctic. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But that's the basic giant hemispheres where they are. And then I guess you could maybe lump in some of their investment projects, in the Middle East, Central Asia, even South America, Africa. Unclear about whether or not you want to categorize that. But they're definitely spending money to exert influence in those places, both for economic and some people might argue military reasons.
Yeah, and we were talking about this before we in the preview of this episode, that China still kind of looks at the U.S. as they still kind of freeload off the U.S. military.
That's right.
And the reason I say that is because the U.S. has 1 million bases in the Middle East. They understand if China is going to be investing in the Middle East, which is a very volatile area, there's a lot of war.
Right. If you're going to build a road in Afghanistan,
you never know when a country in the Middle East is going to erupt in war.
Right.
It can happen in any time in reality. Like look at 2012.
Right.
Look at the Arab Spring. Like just war just broke out in all these countries, and you want there to be some type of police force there, which they look as the U.S. to be like kind of the guys who are managing or policing these areas around. They can invest in countries like Oman, and they can invest in countries like Saudi Arabia, and they can invest in even countries like Israel. There's a lot of investment going from China into Israel. They can invest in these Middle Eastern countries, and they know that U.S. security will provide. The U.S. military will provide security for their investments. So It's something that's really interesting. But at the same time, China is also developing a lot, specifically in their Navy and also in their fighter jets. I'm interested to learn a little bit more about, because we did an episode on the Chinese Navy.
That's right.
Maybe you want to start off by talking about some of the aircraft carriers that they're developing, or you want to go into their fighters first?
Let's do the aircraft carriers, and then we'll jump into the fighters. So what I find funny about China and their Navy is that they haven't really placed a whole lot of attention to their Navy up until very, very recently. And obviously, when we look at the military strength of the United States, like the one giant thing that we have that many countries just do not have access to is nuclear powered supercarriers. These are like basically floating islands that are a mile long and have like 5,000 crew members and hundreds of planes, and basically we can project power anywhere in the world whenever we want, because we have a floating airfield where we can put ordnance over any country at any time, right? And due to maritime law, international law, like you can operate, I think it's up to 14 miles from the coast of any other country, and that's like that's international water. You're good to go. You can be there, but 14 miles is nothing for for an airplane to cover. They can do that in seconds, like really, really quickly. China obviously is like, all right, shit, well, we don't have any aircraft carriers. And the funny thing that we talked about in our episode about super carriers is that they acquired an old Russian aircraft carrier through some nefarious means. They set up like a shell corporation. They went to Ukraine, who had this old Soviet aircraft carrier, and they were like, hey, yeah, we want to buy it because we're going to build a casino with it, and turned out to be the Chinese government. And it's funny because they're setting up this aircraft carrier, and since they purchased it with like less than straightforward intentions, nobody's helping them with it, right? So they have to learn how to both retrofit it to be up to date and modern, but also their pilots have to figure out how to land a plane on a damn aircraft carrier. Like nobody's teaching them how to do that. So it's pretty interesting, but they're investing a whole lot of money into building their own because the one that they have purchased is pretty outdated and very limited in that respect. I believe that they're shooting for their second one very, very soon. And that's important because, especially with all the conflicts going on in the South and East China Seas, and of course with Taiwan, they need to be able to project their military power in places that is not on the mainland. There's only, you can only fly so far in a jet, by yourself. So an aircraft carrier is a really easy way to project power.
What's interesting is that there's a funny story surrounding the purchase of that aircraft carrier. It was a casino. They said they were purchasing it to create a casino ship.
That's right.
And it was complete bullshit.
Yeah, it was just the Chinese government, and it's hilarious because like that would be a massive casino. Can you think about it? Like aircraft carriers are massive. It'd be a huge ass casino.
China, they gamble a lot. What's the gambling capital of Asia? Macau.
Yeah.
I have a friend who she used to work as a as a representative of Macau, like the tourism borough of Macau, and she was like the lead marketer. So she represented the U.S. So she would go travel back and forth to China and to Macau, and she would be like an ambassador of goodwill in the U.S. So she'd have all these events of like why you should visit Macau. I'm saying that right. Macau, is it Macau or Macau?
Macau. That's interesting. And Macau formerly was a Portuguese territory, right? The Portuguese had conquered it. That's why it has the name Macau. It's very Portuguese. But it's beautiful. It's like Vegas on steroids. Like it's nuts. Like it's crazy. It's much bigger.
My friends would make fun of her, be like, why would I want to go to Macau? And then she'd be like, it's the biggest gambling capital in the world. And then they'd be like, sign me up. Let's go.
Yeah.
Different gambling, though. It's like a bunch of guys, like, you know, playing Russian roulette.
Like Mahjong.
Mahjong. I just picture a bunch of
Plinko.
Chinese businessmen chain smoking and yelling on their phone.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I picture too. But it's a beautiful city, and it's awesome.
That's Flushing, New York, by the way.
Yeah.
If you want to have if you want to see Flushing, New York, that's one of the Chinese businessmen yelling on their phone in front of off track betting,
which is, by the way, legal now. Didn't we just get that win? We can sports bet now. That's a thing.
Yeah. It's a big win, and gambling is okay in my book as long as you don't abuse it.
Yeah,
it's fun to gamble, but if you abuse,
if you have problems with gambling, dial 311.
Gamble your money with me. I'll make you $1 million if you have $10,000 to invest right now in our studio gear and our live feed. Then we'll make you a billionaire overnight. We're going to compete with CRTV. We're going to compete with Crooked Media. We'll compete with who else will we? Who are the other big podcasting networks?
Podcasting? Joe Rogan.
Joe Rogan doesn't have a net. Well, I guess he's the Joe Rogan Network, but he's like pretty much independent. He does everything on his own.
Networks. I don't know.
He's not unlike one of these like Crooked Media that has like Pod Save America and all these different things and stuff like that. That's who we're trying to conquer. That's why you need to rate and review the podcast so we can conquer them. They still have like 40,000 more ratings than we do, so we need to catch up. I would love to. That would be the dream to pass them on in like the rankings on iTunes. That would be really fun. We will one day,
especially if you support us on Patreon. By the way,
especially if you support us, give money.
We need your money.
Give money. No, only do it if you really like. We're not trying to pressure you. We're still gonna issue free content. Like we just wanna. We want to just see where it goes. All right.
So we talked about the aircraft carrier.
So
maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Aircraft carriers. All right, buddy. So
airplanes now.
Airplanes. So the J-2 fighter. That's the big one. J-20 fighter.
Mm-hmm.
What's the deal with that?
So J-20 is kind of a clone of the Su-57, which is the Sukhoi 57 by Russia, arguably one of the best fighters in the world, second only to the F-22 in my opinion, which is the American-made one. And so this is a fifth generation fighter. We also have another awesome episode on stealth technology and stealth fighters that you can watch for more context. But this plane, this J-20 fighter, wasn't planned on being released anytime soon, and now we're coming to find out that they're accelerating that. And this is interesting because the thing about stealth technology and about stealth fighters and Gen 5 fighters.
That's a myth.
No, it's real. I mean, the thing to point out to people who might not have watched, our video on stealth fighters is that stealth doesn't mean invisible, right? Like you can still physically see it with your eyes, but stealth means that that the plane itself refracts radar in such a way that it doesn't get picked up on the radar screen, and they have a very small, what is called a radar cross section, and that's the estimated size of an object when captured by radar. So, for example, the F-22 arguably has some of the best stealth, and it has a radar cross section of like a small insect. So that's, I mean, this is a plane, right? It's massive. So on a radar, it looks like nothing, right? It doesn't even show up. Now these Su-57s and the J-20s probably have something closer to like the size of a table or something like that, which is still very small in comparison to a giant jet fighter. But that's really important because that means that they can slip in and out undetected. But what's interesting about this plane is that it's also a dogfighter. So they modeled it after the Su-57. It's very possible that they might have stolen technology from them, and it's very possible that they might have stolen stealth coding and engine, the way that they mask the engines from the F-22s, which is pretty interesting because, we don't know how they might have gotten that technology, and the likelihood is that they probably got it from, some of the people that we're selling military weapons to, which is why we don't give out our best stuff. Like we don't sell the F-22s, and that's really important. But
so they're getting technology from people that we're selling military equipment to.
yeah, evidently, there's a lot of striking similarities to the technology that they're using in their planes.
The rumor is, and I think
The rumor mill.
I haven't confirmed this myself, but I've heard journalists that I follow say that Israel's the one that's selling them this.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of that. Yeah,
I actually haven't myself looked and confirmed it, so I'm not saying it's fact, but I've heard from other journalists say that that's Israel's the one who's selling them that technology.
Yeah, and it's troubling too because that the technology is pretty amazing. I mean, it can slip in undetected. They can drop bombs wherever they want with impunity, and that's threatening. Now, in a 1v1 fight, there's no way that the J-20 is even going to come close to our F-22s. Our F-22s are fucking impressive. They fly faster. They get better ordnance, better technology in general. But they will be able to bully the people in their region with this jet, right? And I'm thinking people like the Philippines, in the South China Sea. I'm thinking people like Taiwan, just off their coast. They can definitely bully the shit out of people with this plane, and that's what's somewhat threatening about them advancing this fighter so much quicker than everyone expected.
So I have a question for you. Do you think that this is the main, because Japan has also increased its military budget a lot.
That's right.
We talked about this the last time we spoke.
Uh-huh.
They're buying F-35s.
But they really want F-22s. That's what they want.
there was an F-35 crash recently.
Yeah,
if I'm not mistaken, in Japan, and
it disappeared. Yeah, we don't know where it is.
Yeah, it just disappeared. We don't know where it was.
Fucking Asian airspace just has a tendency of making airplanes disappear.
Yeah, it's weird. There's such big zones of just nothing in the Indian Ocean where you can end up and you can just sink, and then there's no way that they're going to find the wreckage.
Yep. No one even knows.
Unless it comes up on the coast of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Malaysia, Flight 90, what was the flight number?
The Malaysian Air, I forget the number, but the Malaysian flight.
The Malaysian flight, they said what happened. I think the theory is that it was on its way to China. It was on its way to, I believe, Beijing, if I'm not mistaken. It was on its way to China, so it was going north. And it somehow got rerouted south, and then it went south into the Indian Ocean and just it had ran out of fuel because it was just not near any type of landing strip or any type of land mass where they could land, or even if they did land in an emergency water landing, they would have never been found because that's how desolate that area is. It's probably where the F-35 is. And
yeah,
see, maybe you'll see it wash up on the coast of Africa or someplace.
It's a bad look for the United States. It makes it look like the F-35 is just inadequate, which some people can argue. But I also think that just user error is pretty big in a lot of this shit too. So
the F-35, listen, here's the thing with the F-35. Now, it's really expensive, and they made it more expensive than it had to be for political reasons. That's my stance on it.
Right.
Now, if the plane does what it says it does, if it's able to do all the multi-purpose activities and be an effective plane for all three branches of the military,
right,
and more specifically, if it's supposed to do the reason why the F-35 kind of stands apart is because it has that really big that processing power, right? You
That's right.
confirm that it has
The
that
flying
really
computer.
process,
Yep.
a flying computer, and like the new generation of pilots, they're not necessarily going to be dogfighting. Like they don't see that. I don't think the U.S. military, the State Department, they look at
A lot of the world doesn't think
dogfighting.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't look as the U.S. the future of warfare being like Tom Cruise in a Tomcat. I forget who he was in a dogfight with in the movie, but I don't think they see that as the future of U.S.
They see it as barbaric. It's like, we don't ride in like the Dothraki into the dead, like that's
outdated
silly,
warfare.
you know?
They kind of see it as like some type of like floating. If you played StarCraft, I think this would be a pretty good comparison. Like you're like a floating StarCraft machine where you're flying and hovering around, and you're controlling different drones from different areas. You have complete surveillance of like whatever the mile radius is.
Super like long range missiles that you can fire so that you can hit targets so far away that they didn't even know you were there in the first place. Like,
that's what the plane is supposed to be. And like, that's obviously the military analyst and from Navy, from the Navy and from Air Force they know much more of what it's supposed to be and can give you better analysis. However, like if that's the future of warfare, then I understand the purpose of the plane. It's just that the fact that there's just so many issues, I think it just comes from the political reasons of trying to make the plane as expensive as possible.
That's right.
The thing costs over $1 trillion right now. So that is the design process. So
it's a little.
We're not talking about
47 states and 9 different countries is how they set up the manufacturing for this plane. It's ridiculous.
And Lockheed Martin, it's the planes in the past that have been built have been really good. But Lockheed Martin has this kind of weird, nefarious relationship as the primary contractor to the United States when it comes to military aviation. And it's just kind of concerning because, Boeing doesn't even really make great military aircraft. They make great commercial aircraft.
Well, they do. I'll stop you there. They do make military aircraft, just not the sexy ones that we talk about, like fighter jets and.
They
shit
make like
that.
Carriers and stuff like that.
Yeah, they make like C-130 gunships and shit. So it's they make planes.
yeah. But like Boeing.
But I see what you're saying.
But Boeing's main. If I was going to imagine, I actually don't know this, to be completely honest, what their revenue comes from. Is it from state contracts or if it comes from selling to airlines? But all right, that's the question for a different day. All right, so J-2 fighter, if it engaged in an F-35, would it knock it out of the sky?
F-35 probably. F-22 definitely not.
Okay. How about the older birds? How about like the older birds of.
I mean, we're updating a lot of them. So like we have these updated F-15Xs where we're going to add some stealth technology to. I think the F-15s would probably hold their own for a little while. Maybe like retrofitted F-16s, but I mean, it's a 5th gen fighter. It's going to do really well. That J-20 is going to do well.
You're going to have a bunch of people complaining about the definition of 5th gen fighder. Comment section because everyone debates that. Like, that's not an F-gen.
That's Gen 4.5. Hello. My stealth. All right, let's move on.
All right. China Chi. All right. South China Sea, their outpost over there, they're getting pretty aggressive with man-made islands and stuff like that, like the Spratly Islands. What's going on over there?
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about the Spratly Islands. So like back in, I think it was 2015, Xi Jinping came over, the United States and told Obama, he was like, we're not interested in militarizing, the Spratly Islands. That's not, that's in the South China Sea, by the way. That's not what we're doing. We're just, doing some economic activity in the area because they have shipping lanes there and that's it. We're not militarizing it. Come to find out now in 2019, like years later, they are building man-made islands and laying claim to them. And part of that is like a legal thing, so they built those islands, therefore that's sovereign territory for them, therefore they can extend the international water range around that fake military installation to 14 miles outside of that, right? So like they're just increasing their sphere of influence. But they're also putting a bunch of shit on there. So like they're doing like anti-air weapons, missile systems, radar systems, airfields, all kinds of shit in this area. And that's concerning. That particular area is a big shipping lane for Pacific, for the Pacific, the Eastern Pacific economies. And so it kind of sucks, what they're doing over there, because they're making it very difficult to resolve sovereign issues in the South China Sea, because they're putting all their military tech there. They're basically like saying, come and get it. Philippines, if you think this is yours, come and get it. And the Philippine Congress recently just ordered their military to protect the South China Sea, right? So we're going to see some tensions rise there. And I know that the United States just sent a bunch of carriers over there, and other military naval vessels. So we're ratcheting up the heat over there. That's not to say we're about to go to war with China over the South China Sea, but what I am saying is that you put enough military weapons in a certain spot that's contested, and you're gonna cause some problems.
I'm sure Japan likes this. Japan, again, we were talking about how they're increasing their military budget as well.
Mm-hmm.
And these countries that look at a lot of these countries in the South Pacific that look at them as a bully state,
right?
Because China is a bully state.
Yeah, they are. Without a doubt.
They're looking to Japan as somebody who will thumb their nose at China. So I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic that plays out the future of Sino-Japanese relations. Not to say that there'll ever be a war. I highly doubt that. But I think that you'll see that Japan will continue to increase its military budget as well.
Right. I mean, they could just point to the South China Sea and be like, hey, look, they said they weren't going to do this, and now they're doing this, and now they're mad close to us, and we're afraid, and we would like some better tech. And they're one of the top 10 military spending. I mean, I mentioned it before, they're like 8 or 9 or something like that, but they're spending money. And they're also spending money now on non-defensive, so offensive technology. Like they really, really, really want F-22s because they see China and that J-20 fighter as a threat to them, and they want to be able to meet it head on with a fighter that's equally powerful in the sky, more powerful in the sky. I don't blame them. I honestly don't.
Yeah, and they could always see, the thing about Japan is that they have the big bases in Okinawa, and a lot of the people who live in Okinawa are really unhappy with those bases. They don't want them there.
That's because some of our troop might be doing some fucked up things in
it's
Japan.
Because here's the reason. Like, I'm not trying to disparage people in the service, but like a lot, when you have a bunch of 22-year-olds and if you have thousands of 22-year-olds in one area and just congregated in one city, and they don't speak the language, and they do what 22-year-olds do. They drink and get rowdy, and they want to have sex. It forms up prostitution rings and things like that. There's been cases of people of girls getting raped. Obviously, there were some really big cases in the 90s where there was a truck full of guys who raped a young, I think it was like a 12-year-old girl.
That's fucked up. Yeah,
it was a really messed up case. I think this happened back in '94. But there's always been kind of this tension between the military in Okinawa and the people who live there, just because they see what it's just like having a college town in there, and they don't want it.
Right.
And I'm not saying that all of them are bad or anything like that. I'm just saying,
and we're also not downplaying the fucked up things that they've done either. Right.
I'm just saying that if you got 1 out of 100 soldiers, if he's a scumbag, then that's bad. Like, then that's probably going to rub off on the community, even if it's 99% of them are fine.
That's right.
And I'm sure most of them are fine, but you're always going to get some shitty guys, and they're going to engage in some bad behavior. So it's going
Well,
to
I
be
mean that kind of ratchets up the tension, right? Because Okinawa is there for a reason, right? After World War II, Japan basically signed a bunch of treaties saying like we will not be offensive, we won't have like a standing military, we just want enough like weapons and arms to defend ourselves if someone wants to try and fuck with us. Um, and we'll let the United States take care of like our larger offensive forces. So that's why we have bases there. So that Okinawa base, that's our spring off point in case China or Russia or someone else or North Korea or someone like that decides to cut out a line. Like that's why we have that there. But now that's causing trouble in Japan, and all of these other players in the region are acting like, frankly, bullies. So they're like, hey, like, we need to change our policy, and we need to start spending more money, and we need to acquire some tech that'll be like, hey, don't fuck with us. We've got F-22s, So I totally see where this is going. I don't think that Japan is being unreasonable in their requests and being unreasonable in their ramping up of military spending. It does not appear, in my opinion, that they are going to act aggressively in the region or act, offensively in the region. It seems to me like a defensive move, but hopefully Japan never proves me wrong, because that would be fucked up.
I think mainly Japan's motive is to the thumb the nose at China so they can gain more influence in other countries in the Pacific.
Right, but economic influence, not
yeah, not
not
imperial.
military. Yeah,
We're not talking about imperial Japan right here. We're
right.
talking about like economic, new world. Not new. I don't want to use the word new world order, but economic interest, investment, and stuff like that. Okay, let's get off this. Let's go into the big kind of like elephant in the room, China and Taiwan.
Taiwan. Yep.
All right. Give us a lowdown on what that, or give us the basic history of that.
Yeah. So Taiwan used to be a part of China and have since separated, and they consider themselves an independent state. China thinks otherwise. China still believes one China, one country. Like that's our shit. And the U.S. has been, I mean, we've been on Taiwan's side for the most part, in terms of like having them be a sovereign nation and supporting them in that respect. And we have some loose like promises that we will defend Taiwan in the event of like a China incursion. And what I find interesting is with China ratcheting up all of their military spending and posturing in the region, we're now selling Taiwan a ton of new military tech, including M1 Abrams tanks and F-16 fighters, some newly retrofitted F-16 fighters. So we're definitely, I don't want to say that we're picking sides, but we're kind of picking sides, and I think we're going with Taiwan. But at the same time, like our politics is super weird right now with China, so I'm not super sure where we're going with that. All I know is that there is a strait between China and Taiwan, the Taiwan Straits, and it's only about 180 miles wide. It's very, very important for economic activity, for shipping lanes. It is international waters, so the United States military has a position on it that they will willingly and freely travel that strait, right? So they'll send their ships through, they'll send our carriers through. But they also say that China totally has the right to move through that shipping lane as well. So China will send their military tech through it. Sometimes causes a little bit of tension, but it's really, really important that we keep that as international waters and that we don't start ratcheting up any military presence there, because it is an important shipping lane. Much like, not as important as the Straits of Hormuz, for example, but kind of the same idea, right? We don't want to cut off any of the free motion of economic activity in the area. And with China doing as much as it has been and ratcheting up their military spending and their and putting, building fake islands with military tech on it, like I think it's kind of important that we watch out for Taiwan and make sure that they're not going to, China can easily take that shit over if they really, really wanted to, but I don't think they're stupid enough to do it.
Yeah, I doubt they'll do that, but what? So right now, is it just mainly rhetoric and kind of saber rattling with Taiwan?
Yeah, but it's also like, money spending too, so like they're spending money to China's spending money to like set up outposts all kind of like in the area, military technology in the area, and at the same time Taiwan's buying more military equipment, and it just feels like it feels scary. I feel like we'll be all right. Eventually China will realize like, hey, we've towed the line a little too far. We need to chill out. Like that's where I think this is headed. But for right now, the tension is pretty high, and I think it's worth keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's kind of been that's been a hot spot for so long right now, but I don't know. I feel like it's going to be. I honestly need to learn more about this, but um, if China, I don't think there'll be any kind of engaged conflict there. I'll just say that. I'll leave
Yep.
it at that.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at
Let's
that.
hope that that's the case. Yeah.
All right. All right. Last thing, and then let's wrap this sucker up. So the Arctic Circle. So something that I was reading in earlier was that with all this being said about U.S. and China being competitors, there's cooperation with the U.S. and China in certain aspects. One of the aspects has to do with their Coast Guard. So the Chinese Coast Guard and the American Coast Guard, they cooperate in terms of catching illegal fishing activity. So most of them come from China,
Right.
and they both have interest in preserving I guess environmental regulations or preserving wildlife and fish in those seas. They don't want it to be illegally poached, especially China. They have a diet of mostly fish, and the U.S. has interest in that as well. So they cooperate on things like that. So you'll literally see Chinese Coast Guards boarded on American ships to when they arrest somebody who's illegally fishing. The Chinese Coast Guard will go and they will arrest them and send them to China to be prosecuted and put in a whatever camp, a re-education
concentration camp. Let's be real.
But in Arctic Circle as well. So what exactly is going up in the Arctic Circle right now between China and the U.S.? I'm actually kind of not in the loop on this at all.
Yeah, so I think it's important to talk about, why it is that we're even thinking about the Arctic right now. I mean, when you think about the Arctic, you're like, well, what the fuck could possibly be up there? It's just a bunch of ice. Well, actually, thanks to climate change, we're seeing about a 40% reduction in sea ice during the summer months than what we normally see. And why that's important, other than to point out like a hippie theory about like why we should care for our planet, which we absolutely should. There's things happening now in the Arctic that were previously unavailable. The first big thing is trade routes. So the Earth is a globe. It is circular. Sorry, flat earthers. That's not a thing.
Are you sure?
I'm totally sure on this one. When you need to go from point A to point B, sometimes it's easiest to go up and around instead of all the way across. And that's true of shipping routes in China, right? So if you look at airplanes and how they fly from, say, California to China, they're not going directly across the the Pacific Ocean. They're going actually up and over, because that's actually the closest route. And now with a lot of the sea ice breaking apart and basically not existing anymore, that gives us a lot of brand new opportunities to be able to start shipping in a more effective way. Now, we were talking about China and their One Belt, One Road and reopening the Silk Road. This is right in line with that, right? It's basically saying we can find a faster way to get our goods from point A to point B through the Arctic. And we want to basically exercise our economic activity through that. And so a lot of different countries are in it. And there is a basically what's called the Arctic Council. And it's been around for a while. And China actually joined in May of 2013 as a permanent observer. because they basically wanted to be a part of this, even though they're not technically in the Arctic Circle. Like they have economic interests there, but a lot of different countries like the United States, Canada, Finland, Russia, Sweden, Norway, places like that border on the Arctic Circle are all a part of this council to basically maintain sovereignty in the region, but also to foster economic activity through it. So that's the one thing, right? So shipping lanes. So China and the United States and a bunch of other countries are building a lot of these ships that basically break ice so that we could, ship things through that ice, right? Really, really important. The other big thing is that now that the ice is gone, we're now noticing a bunch of resources there. I'm talking about oil is up there. There's like trillions of dollars of oil in the Arctic right now that is untapped, and everyone knows oil, war for oil, like you like to say. There's nobody lives in the Arctic, so we can just go and take it, basically. So a lot of different countries are scrambling to the north to take advantage of the oil, but also there's huge reserves of gold, silver, platinum that's just basically untouched. Nobody's developing there, and that's why a lot of countries, especially China, are using this using global warming to gain some money out of, which is, I think, super interesting. Now the threats there is that the Arctic is kind of like the Wild West. Nobody lives in the North Pole. Nevertheless, so technically it's everybody's, especially the people who border it. And China's not in the Arctic Circle, and nevertheless is spending a lot of money and sending a lot of things up there. And I think there's some threats of like Chinese submarines and United States submarines like coming into conflict up there, as well as Russian submarines. So there's a lot of shit going on up there. Last thing I want to say, not related to China but related to Russia. Evidently, we found. Do you know what a beluga whale is? A white beluga whale?
Yeah, I heard that story that it had cameras on it, or
it had like all right, so it's a beluga whale, right? It's a white, beautiful whale. Maybe we'll show a picture of it now. And it seemed to be very friendly to people, and it was very well trained, and it's swimming around in the Arctic, and it had like a harness on it, like with like a camera and like some other, like, I don't know, GPS. I don't know what the fuck is on it. But like evidently the going theory is that this beluga whale was trained by the Russians and it's a spy. And it's just like swimming around in the Arctic and shit, doing God knows what. But it would like freely go up to like ships, and like they were feeding it and like petting it and shit. Super interesting.
It was friendly.
Yeah, it was
so
totally
obviously
friendly.
It had human contact before.
Right. It was trained.
Yeah, I saw that's really interesting. I saw that story of
on the harness. It said like Russian or something, like I forget exactly what it was. It said something that basically said like product of Russia, like made in Russia.
Yeah, I was reading about that. That's really funny. Hey, like I couldn't tell you what's the strategy behind that is, unless it's like whales have gained such a level of intelligence that they can actually like knowingly collect and deliver intelligence
to the Russians.
Watch out for whales. Watch out for whales. They will if you touch it, you'll get malware.
Yeah. But so yeah, the Arctic is of extreme importance now that there's like less ice up there. For those reasons, what are your thoughts on that? What do you think?
I want to just point out. So if you are looking at a map of China, so the reason why this is part of the Silk Road extension is because it will go, if they can go north from Beijing and then like over Russia and then past like over Norway and then down to like Belgium or France. So they are kind of like just making this really weird route that's kind of unheard of, and
up and over instead of all the way around.
Up and over instead of all the way around. And it's really interesting that we're finding resources there, but that's not surprising. We're finding resources in Alaska all the time. We're finding billions of barrels of oil and off the coast of Alaska frequently, and it just kind of shows you that our level of hydrocarbons right now are pretty much at a level where we'll probably sustain, like hydrocarbons will be available probably for the next 10,000 years. That's what I've heard from a lot of experts, that it's just so steadily available. What's not available is just the labor it takes time to produce and refine that into oil and gas that can be used for utility. But I mean, that will be developed as well as populations increase and people have more learning based.
I don't think that we're going to be using oil for very much longer anyway.
I mean, I think that we're going to be using it, but I just want to I just want to make the point that oil is not finite, so it's not like it will never go away. And I mean, oil is finite, but like we have there's so many oil reserves that are being discovered that there'll always be oil that's going to be discovered. I think that oil will be used in most countries probably until at least 2050, until countries start really developing nuclear power, until that's kind of ironed out.
I'm all about what Dr. Zubrin said when he was on our show. Dr. Zubrin, president of the Mars Society, was saying that, you know, we're making big strides in nuclear fusion, not fission, which I totally believe. I've been reading a lot of really awesome reports that suggest that we're getting closer and closer by the day, which will make oil. I mean, it's not like we'll stop using it altogether, but it'll be like, well, why are you using oil? We have fusion now.
Hey, I'm all about nuclear energy when we're making strides in it. So
you almost had a Freudian slip there. I'm all about the oil.
I'm all fine. I'm fine with that progress, and I'm just for the best available energy at the time. That's kind of what I'm for. So when nuclear fusion is fusion, right?
Fusion, right? Fusion, like Vegeta and
when that becomes the best source of energy,
and, Goku. What's that?
When that becomes the best source of energy for the world, then I'm 100% down for it. All right, so we are at, how much time are we on right now?
We're on quite a bit, so I think this is a good wrapping point.
All right, so I wanted to talk about Game of Thrones for a little bit before we wrapped up, but I don't know.
Spoiler alert ahead.
I think we'll just save it for another level. I already nerded out on Game of Thrones enough in the beginning, and I'm also late to some. I'm late and I'm getting yelled at right now. But all right, guys. Thank you so much for joining today. It's always a pleasure doing these podcasts, and we really appreciate everyone listening. So, announcement: we have a Patreon right now. I will have the details of the tiers and all that in the description of this podcast. Most of you guys just listen on audio. But we're going to be issuing incentives and things like that. It just helps us support the show. Obviously, the number one way to support the show, if you're on Apple Podcasts, is rate and review. That's what helps our rankings, and that's what gets us more attention to, I'll say it, advertisers. And that's the goal, to have advertising spots so we can deliver this content and we can
get better
and deliver more of this content with the monetary incentive of making better content and putting out more content, because we want to be we're an honest broker in information, and we want to make sure that we're continuing to give you honest information on geopolitics as well as history. So do what you can. I'll probably give more detailed instructions on how to do that after the show, and then we'll wrap it up right here because I am getting a earful or a text full for being late to a birthday party. All right. Peace, guys.
See ya.